When no work was assigned, when days offered no task and no direction, and when time stretched forward without purpose. What happens to a person when doing nothing is no longer a pause, but the condition itself? At first, the absence of work did not register as a problem, because rest often arrives disguised as relief, and relief rarely raises suspicion when it appears quietly and without resistance. The days began without instruction, unfolded without obligation, and ended without any clear marker to distinguish one from another, allowing time itself to expand gently, unchecked by purpose or demand. What made this condition deceptive was its softness, because nothing forced the men to stop working and nothing prevented them from starting either, leaving the absence of activity suspended in a space that felt temporary. They waited for tasks that did not arrive, assuming that direction would return naturally, because direction had always returned before, and expectation is slow to adjust when nothing contradicts it directly. Hours passed without interruption, filled not with strain or conflict, but with stillness, a stillness that felt harmless at first because it asked nothing and imposed nothing. The men occupied themselves briefly with small motions, pacing familiar paths, adjusting clothing, or observing routine details, gestures that created the illusion of engagement without offering substance. Without work to anchor the day, time lost its structure, stretching outward without resistance. And when time stretches without boundary, it becomes difficult to measure or contain. The absence of demand removed urgency, and without urgency, there was no reason to begin or end anything, allowing moments to blend together without distinction. At first, this blending felt calming because pressure had eased and effort was no longer required, but calm without purpose tends to hollow rather than restore. The men found themselves watching the day unfold rather than participating in it, observing light shift, sounds repeat, and patterns loop without variation. What unsettled them was not boredom in the conventional sense, because boredom implies restlessness, and restlessness requires desire, and desire had begun to quiet. Instead, they experienced a slow thinning of engagement, a gradual withdrawal of attention from the world around them as nothing called it forward. Work, when present, gives shape to time by dividing it into before and after, effort and release. But without it, time existed as a single, uninterrupted surface. This surface offered no friction, and without friction, there was nothing to push against, leaving the men suspended in a state that felt neither active nor restful. They did not question this immediately, because questioning requires contrast, and there was nothing to compare this state against once the days began to repeat themselves closely. The absence of tasks removed a subtle but essential form of validation, because work confirms presence, signaling that a person is needed somewhere, even if only briefly. Without that signal, presence began to feel unnecessary, as though existing itself required no justification and therefore offered no direction. The men remained physically present, yet their attention drifted inward, searching for something to occupy the space that work had once filled. Thoughts appeared briefly and then faded, because thought without application quickly loses momentum, leaving behind a quiet mental plateau. Time moved forward without resistance, but movement without engagement feels heavier, not lighter, because nothing marks progress or completion. Meals arrived and passed. Rest followed rest, and the cycle repeated without variation, reinforcing the impression that the day existed simply to be endured rather than used. The men did not feel punished, because punishment implies intent, and this absence felt unintentional, almost accidental, making it difficult to respond with anger or protest. Instead, they adapted slowly, lowering expectations, conserving energy, and reducing movement, because movement without purpose tends to exhaust rather than sustain. The body adjusted to stillness, slowing its rhythms, while the mind followed, releasing its grip on anticipation and allowing the day to carry itself forward. What had once been a pause between efforts became the condition itself, a long interval with no clear beginning and no defined end. As this condition persisted, the men began to sense that something essential had been removed, not forcibly, but quietly, and that its absence was changing how time was experienced. The lack of work did not break the day, but it broke its shape, flattening experience into a continuous present that offered no resolution. In this flattened time, effort felt unnecessary and rest felt undeserved, because both depend on contrast to retain meaning. The men continued to wait, not actively, but passively, existing within a stretch of time that neither progressed nor concluded in any recognizable way. By the end of this early phase, doing nothing had ceased to feel like a temporary condition and had begun to feel like the default, a state in which time moved forward while purpose quietly receded, leaving behind a stillness that did not heal but slowly unsettled everything beneath it. As the absence of work continued without interruption, it began to shift from being an external condition into an internal presence, one that quietly reshaped how the men related to effort, intention, and even desire. At first, they still expected motivation to return on its own, assuming that the will to act existed independently of structure, yet without tasks to call it forward that will remain dormant, waiting without direction. The mind, accustomed to responding to necessity, struggled to generate momentum in a space where nothing required action, because motivation thrives on demand, and demand had been removed. Days passed in which the idea of beginning something felt heavier than remaining still, not due to fatigue, but because initiation without purpose felt arbitrary and unconvincing. The men noticed that even small efforts required deliberation, as though the internal signal that once prompted movement had weakened, leaving hesitation where instinct had once operated. This hesitation did not feel like resistance, because resistance implies opposition, and there was nothing to oppose, only an emptiness that offered no reason to move in any direction. As a result, the threshold for action rose steadily, making inactivity the easier and more natural choice, not through laziness, but through adaptation to an environment that did not reward effort. The longer this condition persisted, the more the men found themselves conserving energy by default, choosing stillness over movement, because stillness demanded nothing and promised no disappointment. What made this shift difficult to reverse was its subtlety, because nothing dramatic marked the moment when effort began to feel optional, allowing the change to settle without notice. The absence of work also removed feedback, and without feedback, effort lost its meaning, because meaning often arises from response rather than intention alone. When actions produced no outcome beyond passing time, the desire to act weakened further, reinforcing the sense that doing nothing was not only acceptable, but efficient. The men began to experience a quiet detachment from their own impulses, observing thoughts of action arise and fade without being followed, as though intention itself had lost authority. This detachment created a sense of distance from the self, not alarming at first, but unfamiliar, because the link between wanting and doing had grown less reliable. The body mirrored this change, responding to reduced demand by slowing, conserving strength that no longer had an outlet, while the mind adjusted by narrowing its focus to immediate sensation. In this narrowed state, future-oriented thinking became more difficult, because the future offered no tasks to anticipate, leaving the present to stretch outward without boundary. The men did not feel despair in a conventional sense, because despair implies expectation unmet, and expectation itself had begun to dissolve, leaving behind a flatter emotional landscape. What replaced it was a muted heaviness, a sense that time moved forward without carrying anything with it, making each moment feel complete, yet strangely empty. Without work to organize effort, self-worth began to lose its anchors, because contribution often affirms existence, and without contribution, existence felt less defined. The men did not articulate this loss, because articulation requires clarity, and clarity had been softened by the uniformity of the days, leaving feelings diffuse and difficult to name. As motivation weakened, initiative followed, creating a cycle in which inaction confirmed itself, each still moment making the next easier to accept. The absence of structure allowed this cycle to deepen, because nothing intervened to interrupt it, leaving the men alone with a form of idleness that no longer felt temporary. Time continued to pass, and with it the internal pressure to do something meaningful diminished, replaced by an acceptance of stillness as the most reasonable response. In this state, even the desire to change the condition weakened, because change requires effort, and effort had lost its persuasive power. The men remained aware that something fundamental was shifting, yet without urgency or language to confront it. The shift continued unchecked. By the end of this phase, idleness was no longer merely the absence of work, but a presence that shaped thought, behavior, and motivation alike, pressing inward gently but persistently, and preparing the ground for deeper consequences that would follow. As idleness continued to shape the days from the inside, it began to affect something deeper than motivation, because purpose does not exist in isolation, and when it weakens, the sense of self that once depended on it begins to soften as well. The men no longer measured themselves by what they did, because there was little to do, and without action as reference, identity lost one of its most reliable anchors. They still recognized who they were in memory and name, yet this recognition felt distant, detached from daily experience, as though it belonged to a version of themselves that existed elsewhere in time, without tasks to confirm usefulness or contribution. The question of relevance quietly emerged, not as a thought to be answered, but as a condition to be endured. The absence of purpose did not provoke immediate distress, because distress requires contrast, and contrast had faded along with structure, leaving the change to unfold without sharp edges. The men began to experience themselves more as observers than participants, present within their own lives, but less engaged in directing them. This shift was subtle enough to feel natural, because observation requires less effort than participation, and effort had already become difficult to justify. As days passed without meaningful differentiation, the internal narrative that once framed experience weakened, leaving fewer reasons to reflect on who they were becoming. Identity, which often forms through repetition of meaningful roles, now faced repetition without meaning, and repetition without meaning tends to erode rather than reinforce. The men did not feel that they were losing themselves, because loss implies awareness of disappearance, and awareness itself had grown muted, making the change difficult to name. Instead, they felt a gradual flattening of self-perception, as though the edges that once defined them had softened into something less distinct. Even memories of purposeful action began to feel abstract, no longer connected to present capability, reinforcing the sense that those versions of the self belonged to a different context. The absence of work removed opportunities for affirmation, and without affirmation, the internal image of the self received little reinforcement. The men noticed that decisions felt less personal, because choice requires preference, and preference depends on engagement, which had been reduced by prolonged idleness. As engagement faded, so did the sense of agency, leaving actions, when they occurred at all, feeling incidental rather than expressive of self. This did not result in despair or collapse, because collapse requires tension, and tension had been replaced by a steady, low-level neutrality. The self adjusted to this neutrality by narrowing its scope, focusing less on identity and more on simple presence, a mode that felt sustainable even if it lacked depth. The men found it easier to exist without defining themselves, because definition invites expectation, and expectation had become burdensome in a world that offered no outlet for fulfillment. Over time, the distinction between who they were and what they did blurred, not because it was resolved, but because neither side asserted itself strongly enough to demand attention. The erosion of purpose thus translated into an erosion of identity, not through confrontation, but through prolonged absence of reinforcement. The men continued to function physically and socially, yet internally they occupied a quieter space where selfhood felt thinner and less demanding. In this space, questions of meaning did not disappear, but they lost urgency, drifting in and out of awareness without ever taking hold. By the end of this phase, the absence of work had done more than fill time, having quietly reshaped how the men experienced themselves, leaving identity less defined by purpose and more by endurance, a condition that felt stable enough to persist, even as something essential continued to wear away beneath the surface. As purpose continued to fade and identity softened, the men began to experience time itself differently, because time, when unstructured by effort or goal, does not move forward so much as it accumulates. Days no longer felt like passages leading somewhere, but like surfaces upon which nothing left a mark, repeating themselves with such similarity that progression became difficult to sense. Without work to divide the hours into before and after, waiting lost its object, transforming from anticipation into a condition that extended without boundary or resolution. The men waited without knowing what they were waiting for, because expectation requires an endpoint, and endpoints had quietly disappeared along with tasks and direction. Time passed, yet did not feel spent, because spending implies exchange, and there was nothing being exchanged for the hours that slipped by. The absence of urgency allowed minutes to stretch outward, flattening experience into a continuous present that offered no contrast and therefore no relief. In this flattened present, waiting no longer felt temporary, because nothing suggested that it would end, leaving the men suspended within a duration that did not progress toward change. The mind adapted by lowering its sensitivity to passing time, because awareness of endless waiting offers no benefit and only increases strain. As a result, attention narrowed further, focusing on immediate sensations rather than on the larger movement of days, reducing the weight of time by refusing to track it closely. The men found it increasingly difficult to recall how long they had been waiting, not because memory failed, but because duration without event does not anchor itself easily in the mind. This lack of temporal anchors made each day feel interchangeable, erasing distinction and diminishing the sense that anything was being approached or left behind. Waiting thus became detached from hope, because hope depends on the belief that something different lies ahead, and belief had weakened under the repetition of sameness. The men did not feel impatience, because impatience implies desire for movement, and desire itself had been softened by prolonged idleness. Instead, they experienced a calm resignation to time's passage, allowing it to move without resistance or engagement. The absence of markers made beginnings and endings lose significance, as waking and sleeping no longer framed progress, but merely marked continuity. In this condition, the future felt abstract, existing more as an idea than as a destination, and ideas without relevance rarely motivate action. The men adapted by existing within shorter mental spans, attending only to what was immediately present, because extending attention beyond that offered no reward. This adaptation reduced distress, but it also deepened detachment, further weakening the connection between time and meaning. Waiting ceased to feel like something endured and became instead the backdrop of existence, an unremarkable constant that shaped perception quietly. The men no longer counted days with intention, because counting implies purpose, and purpose had already receded from experience. Time continued to accumulate without resolution, and with each unremarkable day, the sense that waiting might conclude grew fainter. By the end of this phase, waiting had lost its character as a pause between actions and had become the dominant state itself, a condition in which time passed without offering direction, change, or release, pressing gently but persistently upon everything that remained. As waiting extended without endpoint and time continued to pass without offering direction, the emptiness that surrounded the men began to settle into them more deeply, not as a sudden weight, but as a steady presence that reshaped how they responded to everything else. What made this stage difficult to recognize was its quietness, because nothing dramatic occurred to signal that something was failing, and without a visible failure, the change unfolded without resistance. The absence of work, purpose, and anticipation created a condition in which effort no longer felt justified, because effort depends on the belief that it will lead somewhere, and belief had been worn thin by repetition. The men did not collapse or withdraw entirely, because collapse requires tension, and tension had already been replaced by a calm that felt stable enough to endure. Instead, they experienced a gradual weakening of internal response, as though the systems that once reacted to difficulty had learned that reaction itself was unnecessary. Emotional signals softened further, not disappearing, but losing the intensity that once made them noticeable, leaving behind a muted range of feeling that rarely rose high enough to demand attention. In this muted state, frustration could not fully form, because frustration needs resistance, and resistance had been released in favor of acceptance. Hope, too, lost its sharpness, not because it was consciously abandoned, but because it no longer found anything to attach itself to within the unchanging flow of days. The men continued to function outwardly, maintaining basic routines and interactions. Yet inwardly, they moved through time with reduced engagement, responding less and less to what occurred around them. This reduction did not feel like despair, because despair implies loss recognized, and recognition had become rare in a mental space shaped by sameness. What replaced it was a quiet dulling, a sense that nothing required full attention, because nothing promised to matter beyond the moment it occupied. The absence of meaningful activity removed opportunities for recovery as well as strain, leaving the men suspended in a state where neither exhaustion nor restoration fully took place. Without cycles of effort and relief, the mind lost one of its primary ways of regulating itself, drifting instead into a steady, undifferentiated awareness. The men found it harder to imagine change, not because change was impossible, but because imagination itself requires contrast, and contrast had been erased by prolonged uniformity. Even the idea that this condition might end felt distant, abstract, and emotionally neutral, because endings depend on anticipation, and anticipation had long since faded. The quiet persistence of nothingness thus became the most influential force shaping experience, pressing gently but continuously until responsiveness itself began to thin. By this point, The men were not broken in a visible sense because nothing had snapped or collapsed, yet something essential had weakened quietly beneath the surface. The absence of work had not harmed them through hardship, but through removal, taking away the structures that once sustained engagement and leaving behind a space too empty to support resistance. In this space, endurance no longer felt like a struggle, but like the only available mode of being, one that required little energy and offered little return. By the end of this phase, doing nothing had ceased to be merely an external condition and had become an internal state, one that did not overwhelm the men, but slowly wore down the capacity to feel change itself, leaving them intact in form, yet diminished in responsiveness, shaped by a stillness that broke them not through force, but through its unending presence. In the end, there was no final moment that marked the change, because nothing ended in a way that could be observed or measured. The days continued to pass, shaped not by effort or resistance, but by the quiet persistence of time without purpose. What had once been endured gradually became lived, not because the condition improved, but because there was nothing left to respond to. And so the absence of work did not overwhelm them, but settled in gently, leaving behind a stillness that broke nothing suddenly, yet changed everything slowly.